The sound of aircraft engines thundered across the vast expanse of the Philippine Sea. As Admiral William Bull Halsey stood on the bridge of his flagship, the USS New Jersey, it was October 20th, 1944, and the largest naval battle in human history was about to unfold. The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck as intelligence reports flooded in. The Imperial Japanese Navy was making its final, desperate gamble. Admiral, reconnaissance confirms enemy fleet movements in multiple sectors, reported his chief of staff, studying the coded messages with growing concern. The Japanese had divided their remaining naval forces into four separate task groups, a complex web of deception and destruction that would soon converge on the Philippine islands of Leyte and Samar. For months, American forces had been systematically dismantling Japan's Pacific Empire, island by island, battle by bloody battle. The Japanese high command knew that losing the Philippines would sever their supply lines to the oil-rich Dutch East Indies, effectively strangling their war machine. Emperor Hirohito's admirals had devised Operation WWII, a sophisticated plan that would either restore Japanese naval supremacy or result in the complete annihilation of their fleet. The stakes could not have been higher. General Douglas MacArthur's forces had already established beachheads on Leyte, fulfilling his famous promise to return to the Philippines. But the Japanese were not finished. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, had assembled the largest concentration of Japanese warships since the attack on Pearl Harbor. 3 years earlier, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the Northern Force, built around the aircraft carriers Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitos, and Chiyoda. These once mighty vessels now serve primarily as decoys, their aircraft complement severely depleted after years of attrition. Their mission was to lure Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from the landing sites, leaving MacArthur's troops vulnerable to a coordinated surface attack. The real hammer blow would come from the center force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. His formidable battle line included the massive battleships Yamato and Musashi floating fortresses mounting 18-inch guns that could devastate any surface vessel at extreme range. Supporting them were 3 other battleships, 10 heavy cruisers to light cruisers, and 15 destroyers. This armada would thread through the San Bernardino Strait under cover of darkness, then sweep down on the vulnerable American landing craft at dawn. According to naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive account in the Two Ocean War, the complexity of the Japanese plan reflected both strategic brilliance and the desperation of their position. Admiral Kiyohachimi's second striking force and Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's 4C would simultaneously approach through Surigao Strait from the south, catching the Americans in a devastating pincer movement. If successful, WWII would turn the tide of the Pacific War and force the United States to negotiate a settlement favorable to Japan. But American intelligence had penetrated Japanese communications. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, had positioned his forces accordingly. In addition to Halsey's Third Fleet, Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's Seventh Fleet protected the landing areas with 6 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 28 destroyers, many of them veterans of previous Pacific campaigns. Their crews seasoned by months of combat. The weather was clear, visibility excellent, across thousands of square miles of ocean. Nearly 300 warships and 1,700 aircraft, prepared for the ultimate test of naval warfare. The Battle of Leyte Gulf would determine not just the fate of the Philippines, but the future of the Pacific itself. The first shots of the greatest naval battle in history rang out, not from the guns of mighty battleships, but from the torpedo tubes of 2 American submarines prowling the dark waters off Palawan Island. Commander David McClintock of the USS Darter and Commander Bladen Claggett of the USS Dace had been tracking Admiral Kurita's center force since the early hours of October 23, 1944. Range 2,000 yards and closing, whispered McClintock's executive officer as the massive silhouettes of Japanese warships filled their periscope view. The Darter had achieved perfect positioning for a torpedo attack on what appeared to be a heavy cruiser leading the enemy formation. At 6:30 that morning, McClintock gave the order that would begin the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3, Fire 4. The submarine shuddered as from Mark 14 torpedoes leaped from their tubes, their wakeless trails invisible in the pre-dawn darkness. The target was the heavy cruiser Otago, flagship of Admiral Kurita himself. The Japanese commander was reviewing his battle plans when the first torpedo struck his ship's port side with a tremendous explosion that shook the 8-inch gun cruiser from stem to stern. Within minutes, 3 more explosions rocked the Otago as McClintock's remaining torpedoes found their mark. Abandon ship. All hands abandon ship. The order echoed across the doomed cruiser's decks as she listed heavily to port, her magazines cooking off in secondary explosions that sent pillars of flame hundreds of feet into the air. Admiral Kurita, forced to swim for his life, was eventually rescued by a destroyer, but his flagship was gone, the first major casualty of the battle. The Dace, meanwhile, had maneuvered into position against another target. Commander Claggett's crew worked with practiced efficiency as they prepared their torpedo spread against the heavy cruiser Maya. The Japanese ship, attempting evasive maneuvers, presented her broadest profile to the American submarine at the worst possible moment. Torpedoes running hot, straight, and normal, reported the sonar operator as for more American torpedoes raced toward their target. The Maya, sister ship to the sunken Otago, suffered the same fate. Multiple torpedo hits along her waterline caused catastrophic flooding, and she capsized and sank within minutes, taking 450 sailors to the bottom of Palawan Passage. A third heavy cruiser, the Takao, also fell victim to American submarine attack, but managed to limp away toward Brunei, with severe damage, effectively removing her from the battle. In less than 30 minutes, Kurita had lost to heavy cruisers and seen a third crippled, a devastating blow to his striking force before the main battle had even begun. The submarine attack sent shockwaves through the Japanese fleet. Radio intercepts revealed the confusion and alarm among enemy commanders as they realized American forces had detected their approach. The element of surprise, crucial to the success of Operation Shogo-1, was already compromised. Admiral Kurita transferred his flag to the battleship Yamato, but the psychological impact of the submarine attacks weighed heavily on his mind. The Americans clearly knew he was coming. His carefully planned surprise attack had become a frontal assault against prepared defenders, dramatically reducing his chances of success. News of the submarine victory spread quickly through the American fleet. Admiral Halsey, aboard the New Jersey, received McClintock's contact report with grim satisfaction. The Japanese were finally committing their remaining fleet to decisive battle, exactly what American strategists had hoped for since Pearl Harbor. Aircraft from Task Force 38 began launching reconnaissance missions to locate and track the approaching enemy formations. The stage was set for the next phase of the battle, a massive air assault that would test both fleets' ability to project power across hundreds of miles of ocean. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had begun with American submarines drawing first blood, but the greatest trial lay ahead as Admiral faced Admiral in the ultimate test of naval strategy and seamanship. October 24, 1944. Dawn clear and calm over the Sibian Sea as Admiral Kurita's battered center force pressed eastward toward San Bernardino Strait. Despite the submarine attacks that had cost him 3 heavy cruisers, the Japanese commander still commanded a formidable fleet, centered around the 2 largest battleships ever built, Yamato and Musashi. The Musashi, second ship of the Yamato class, was a floating fortress displacing 72,000 tons and mounting 9 18-inch guns and 3 massive turrets. Her armor belt was 16 inches thick, designed to withstand any weapon in the American arsenal. Her crew of 2,400 sailors believed their ship was unsinkable, a steel embodiment of Japanese naval supremacy. Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 38 had other ideas. At dawn, wave after wave of American aircraft began lifting off from the carriers Intrepid, Cabot, Franklin, and Enterprise. The morning sky filled with the drone of Grumman Hellcat fighters, Douglas Dauntless dive bombers, and Grumman Avenger torpedo planes. Over 100 aircraft in the first strike alone. Enemy battleships bearing 090, range 40 miles, reported Commander William Ellis, leading the strike from the Intrepid. Below them, Kurita's ships had formed into a tight defensive circle, their anti-aircraft guns already beginning to fill the sky with deadly black puffs of exploding shells. The first attack concentrated on the super battleship Musashi. Lieutenant Commander John Forsyth dove his Helldiver through intense flak, releasing his 1,000-pound bomb at minimum altitude. The weapon struck the battleship's forward turret with a tremendous clang, but failed to penetrate the massive armor. Other bombs scored hits on the superstructure, starting fires but causing no critical damage. The torpedo planes achieved better results. Flying at wave-top height through a storm of anti-aircraft fire, they pressed home their attacks with suicidal determination. The aerial torpedoes struck Musashi's port side, causing flooding in several compartments, but failing to slow the giant ship. First strike ineffective against primary target, radioed Ellis as his aircraft headed back to their carriers. Recommend maximum effort on second strike. Admiral Mitcher needed no encouragement. Throughout the morning and afternoon of October 24th, He hurled strike after strike at Kurita's force. The second wave included 60 aircraft from the carriers Essex and Lexington, their pilots grimly determined to prove that air power could sink even the mightiest battleship. Naval aviation expert Clark Reynolds documented in the Fast Carriers that the sustained American air assault on October 24th represented the most concentrated carrier attack of the Pacific War, with over 250 sorties flown against a single enemy force. The Musashi began to show the cumulative effects of repeated hits. By noon, she had taken 4 torpedo and 6 bomb hits, her forward magazines flooding and her bow settling noticeably deeper in the water. But still she steamed on, her massive engines driving her toward her rendezvous with destiny. The third American strike proved decisive. Commander Hugh Winters, leading 40 aircraft from Task Group 38.4, coordinated a perfectly timed attack that overwhelmed the battleship's defenses. Torpedo planes struck from both sides simultaneously while dive bombers plastered her superstructure with heavy bombs. 3 more torpedoes tore into Musashi's hull, followed by direct hits from 2,000-pound armor-piercing bombs. The great ship's damage control teams, working heroically in flooded compartments, could no longer keep pace with the destruction. Her list increased to dangerous angles as thousands of tons of seawater poured through ruptured hull plates. At 3:15 that afternoon, Admiral Kurita made the agonizing decision to detach the dying battleship from his formation. The Musashi, her forward deck awash and fires raging throughout her superstructure, began her final struggle for survival. Captain Toshihira Inoguchi ordered all non-essential personnel to abandon ship, but he and over half his crew chose to remain at their posts. As the sun set over the Sibian Sea, the Musashi rolled slowly to port and disappeared beneath the waves, taking 1,123 sailors with her. The supposedly unsinkable super battleship had succumbed to American air power, her death marking the end of an era in naval warfare. Admiral Kurita, his force now reduced to 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and 13 destroyers, faced a terrible decision. Should he continue toward San Bernardino Strait and his appointment with the American landing force? Or should he withdraw to preserve what remained of his fleet? The fate of the entire operation hung in the balance. While Admiral Kurita's battered center force licked its wounds in the Sibian Sea, another drama was unfolding 200 miles to the south. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force was approaching Surigao Strait, the narrow waterway that would lead them to the American landing beaches at Leyte Gulf. Unknown to the Japanese commander, he was steaming directly into the most perfectly executed ambush in naval history. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf commanded the American forces, guarding the southern approach to Leyte Gulf. His battle line included 6 battleships: Pennsylvania, California, Tennessee, Maryland, West Virginia, and Mississippi, 5 of them veterans of Pearl Harbor, now modernized and thirsting for revenge. Supporting them were 8 cruisers and 28 destroyers, all positioned to execute the classic naval maneuver known as crossing the T. The narrow confines of Surigao Strait would force Nishimura's ships into single file as they approached, presenting their vulnerable bows to the full broadside firepower of Oldendorf's battle line. It was a tactical situation that hadn't occurred since the age of fighting sail, and American gunnery officers relished the opportunity to demonstrate their superiority. "All units report ready for action," signaled Oldendorf from his flagship, the heavy cruiser Louisville, as the evening of October 24th faded into night. His ships were perfectly positioned in a battle line stretching across the northern end of Surigao Strait, their radar-directed guns trained on the southern approaches. Nishimura's force consisted of the battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, the heavy cruiser Mogami, and 4 destroyers. Behind them, Admiral Shima's second striking force followed with the heavy cruisers Nachi and Ashigara, and for more destroyers. The 2 Japanese admirals had failed to coordinate their approach, a critical error that would prove fatal. The first contact came at 11-30-6 that night, when American PT boats attacked Nishimura's van. These small, fast patrol craft couldn't seriously damage the Japanese battleships, but their presence alerted Oldendorf to the enemy's precise location and course. The ambush was set. At 3:09 on the morning of October 25th, 1944, the destroyer USS Melvin fired the first torpedoes of the surface engagement. Her spread of 5 Mark 15 torpedoes raced through the dark water toward the battleship Fuso, Nishimura's flagship. Other American destroyers joined the attack, launching a total of 27 torpedoes at the approaching Japanese column. The Fuso, struck by multiple torpedoes, broke in half with tremendous explosions that lit up the night sky. Her forward section sank immediately, while her stern continued to burn and drift for several hours before finally disappearing. 3 Japanese destroyers also fell victim to the torpedo attack, leaving Nishimura with only the battleship Yamashiro, the cruiser Mogami, and 1 destroyer. But the Japanese admiral pressed on, his remaining ships charging through the narrow strait toward what he believed was the American transport area. Instead, he was heading directly toward Oldendorf's perfectly positioned battle line. Military historian C. Van Woodward noted in the battle for Leyte Gulf that the Japanese showed incredible courage in continuing their attack despite overwhelming odds, exemplifying the warrior spirit that had driven their nation to war. At 3:51, Admiral Oldendorf gave the order his gunners had been waiting for. All ships commenced firing. The night exploded in thunder and flame as 6 American battleships and 8 cruisers opened fire simultaneously. The Yamashiro, caught in the crossfire, disappeared in a forest of shell splashes as hundreds of heavy projectiles bracketed her position. The American gunnery was devastatingly accurate. Radar fire control systems, perfected through years of war, allowed the battleships to engage targets at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards. In total darkness, the Yamashiro, struck repeatedly by 14-inch and 16-inch shells, became a floating inferno within minutes. Admiral Nishimura, realizing his impossible situation, ordered his remaining ships to turn around and escape. But it was too late. The Yamashiro, her superstructure shattered and her hull riddled with holes, capsized and sank at 4:19, taking Nishimura and most of her crew to the bottom of Surigao Strait. The heavy cruiser Mogami, severely damaged and burning, managed to escape southward, but was later finished off by American cruisers. Of Nishimura's original 7 ships, only 1 destroyer survived to tell the tale. Admiral Shima's force, arriving 2 hours later, found the strait littered with burning wreckage. Wisely deciding that discretion was the better part of valor, he ordered his ships to withdraw, without engaging the American battle line. The Battle of Surigao Strait was over. In less than 3 hours, American naval gunnery had achieved what many considered impossible: the complete annihilation of an enemy battle force in a classic surface engagement. It was the last time battleships would duel in the open ocean, marking the end of an era that had begun with wooden ships and iron men. As the guns fell silent in Surigao Strait, Admiral William Bull Halsey faced the most crucial decision of his naval career. Intelligence reports flooding into his flagship indicated that a powerful Japanese carrier force was approaching from the north, exactly the kind of target the aggressive admiral lived to destroy. But accepting this bait would leave the San Bernardino Strait unguarded, potentially exposing MacArthur's landing force to a devastating surface attack. Vice Admiral Gisaburo Ozawa's northern force was indeed approaching, built around the fleet carriers Uikaku and 3 light carriers Riho, Chitos, and Chiyoda. These once proud vessels of the Imperial Navy now carried fewer than 100 aircraft between them, their air groups decimated by months of attrition warfare. Ozawa knew his mission was sacrificial: lure Halsey away from Leyte Gulf, and die gloriously in the process. Enemy carriers confirmed bearing 340, estimated distance to 100 miles. Reported Halsey's intelligence officer as reconnaissance aircraft tracked the Japanese formation. The news sent electric excitement through the 3rd Fleet's command structure. Since the beginning of the war, American doctrine had emphasized the destruction of enemy aircraft carriers above all other objectives. What Halsey didn't know was that Admiral Kurita's center force, bloodied but not broken, was even then threading through San Bernardino Strait under cover of darkness. The Japanese admiral had reversed course after dark, leading his remaining ships for battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers toward their original objective. The trap was closing perfectly. Ozawa played his part to perfection, launching what few aircraft he possessed in fuel attacks against American screening forces. These weak strikes, easily repelled by Hellcat fighters, served their purpose by convincing Halsey that he faced a significant threat. The American admiral took the bait completely, racing northward with his entire fleet in pursuit of what he believed was the primary Japanese force. At midnight on October 24th, Halsey sent a radio message that would become one of the most controversial communications in naval history. Task Force 34 will be formed, he radioed to his subordinate commanders, describing a powerful surface action group built around the fast battleships Iowa, New Jersey, Alabama, and Massachusetts. But the message contained a crucial ambiguity. It didn't specify whether Task Force 34 would actually be formed or simply could be formed if circumstances required. Admiral Kincaid, commanding the 7th Fleet, intercepted Halsey's message and assumed that Task Force 34 was already in position to guard San Bernardino Strait. This fatal misunderstanding would have tragic consequences in the morning hours of October 25th. Meanwhile, Kurita's ships emerged from San Bernardino Strait at 0300 hours, their dark silhouettes invisible against the mountainous backdrop of Samar Island. American picket ships detected their approach, but the warnings came too late to prevent disaster. The Japanese had achieved complete tactical surprise. According to Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison's official history, the Two-Ocean War, Halsey's decision to pursue the northern force represented both strategic brilliance and tactical error, eliminating Japanese carrier aviation while exposing the landing force to surface attack. At 0645, lookouts aboard the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay spotted the distinctive pagoda masts of Japanese battleships on the eastern horizon, enemy surface ships bearing 020, closing fast. The alarm spread quickly through Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's Task Unit 7742, composed of 6 escort carriers and 7 destroyers defending the landing area off Samar. The American escort carriers St. Lo, White Plains, Cullinan Bay, Kitkin Bay, Fanshawe Bay, and Gambier Bay were never designed to fight enemy battleships. Their thin decks and minimal armor made them floating targets for the 16-inch guns of Kurita's battle line. Their only hope lay in speed, smoke screens, and the desperate courage of their destroyer escorts. Admiral Sprague, realizing the impossible situation, immediately ordered his carriers to flee eastward at maximum speed, while launching every available aircraft. His destroyers, led by the USS Johnston under Commander Ernest Evans, turned directly toward the approaching Japanese giants in a suicidal charge that would become legendary in naval annals. The battle off Samar was about to begin. David versus Goliath on the high seas. With the fate of MacArthur's landing force hanging in the balance, Halsey's gamble had succeeded in luring away the Japanese carriers, but it had also exposed the most vulnerable American ships to the most powerful Japanese surface force. The next few hours would determine whether strategic deception or tactical disaster would define the Battle of Leyte Gulf's final outcome. The stage was set for one of the most heroic actions in naval history, as tiny American escort ships prepared to face the full fury of the Imperial Japanese Navy's remaining battleships and cruisers. The morning of October 25, 1944, transformed ordinary American sailors into legends, as Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's Task Unit 774 Ducole Santa Fe III faced the impossible: 6 escort carriers and 7 destroyers against Admiral Kurita's 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Japanese ships outgunned their opponents by a ratio of more than 10 to 1. Yet what followed became the most heroic action in American naval history. Commander Ernest Evans of the destroyer USS Johnston didn't hesitate when he spotted the Japanese battle line emerging from the morning haze. All ahead flank, come left to course 0-9-0, he ordered, leading his ship directly toward the mighty battleship Yamato. Behind him, the destroyers Hull and Harriman followed suit, their 5-inch guns pathetically small compared to the 18-inch monsters they were charging. The Yamato's first salvo sent towers of water skyward around the Johnston, each shell weighing as much as a small automobile. But Evans pressed his attack with reckless courage, closing to torpedo range despite the overwhelming firepower arrayed against him. At 7,000 yards, the Johnston launched her 10 torpedoes, then turned sharply to escape the inevitable retaliation. One torpedo struck the Yamato's bow, flooding several compartments and forcing Admiral Kurita to reduce speed. This single hit, delivered by a ship 1/10 the battleship's size, disrupted the entire Japanese attack formation and bought precious time for the fleeing escort carriers. Admiral Sprague, meanwhile, was performing miracles of seamanship with his small carriers. Using rain squalls and smoke screens to mask their movements, the escort carriers launched every available aircraft while zigzagging desperately to avoid the fall of shot from Japanese cruisers. Their pilots, trained for anti-submarine warfare rather than ship attack, improvised with whatever weapons they could find: depth charges, small bombs, even empty machine gun ammunition to confuse enemy gunners. The heavy cruiser Chikai closed rapidly on the carrier Gambier Bay, her 8-inch guns firing with deadly accuracy. Multiple hits set the small carrier ablaze, her flight deck buckled and her hull taking on water. But her crew fought back with extraordinary courage, continuing to launch aircraft even as their ship was dying beneath them. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hagan, flying a Wildcat fighter from the St. Lo, made repeated strafing runs on the Japanese cruisers despite having no ammunition left. His purpose was psychological, to convince enemy gunners that they were still under air attack and disrupt their fire control. Other pilots followed his example, making dummy runs with empty guns while radioing false position reports to confuse Japanese communications. According to James Hornfisher's definitive account, The Last Stand of the Tinkan Sailors, the actions of Taffy 3 represented the finest example of courage under fire in American naval history, with ordinary sailors rising to extraordinary heroism when faced with impossible odds. The destroyer Hull, commanded by Commander Leon Robert, fought until her guns fell silent one by one, struck by more than 40 shells from Japanese cruisers and destroyers. She continued firing with her remaining turret until it too was destroyed. When her engines finally failed, Robert ordered abandon ship, but stayed aboard with the wounded until the hull rolled over and sank, taking him and half his crew to the bottom. The Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort nicknamed the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, engaged the heavy cruiser Chikuma in single combat. Her 5-inch guns, firing at maximum rate, actually forced the much larger cruiser to turn away temporarily. But the smaller ship's heroic fight ended when Japanese shells penetrated her engine room, causing a catastrophic explosion that broke her back. As the morning wore on, the cumulative effect of the American attacks began to tell on the Japanese fleet. The constant air strikes, though individually weak, forced Kurita's ships to maneuver constantly to avoid torpedoes and bombs. His formation became increasingly disorganized as individual captains took evasive action, breaking up the coordinated attack that might have overwhelmed Taffy 3. The heavy cruiser Kumano, struck by aerial torpedoes, fell out of formation with her bow nearly severed. The Suzuya, damaged by bomb hits, began to slow as fire spread through her superstructure. Most importantly, the psychological pressure of constant attack began to wear on Japanese morale, already shaken by the previous day's losses in the Sibian Sea. At 9-20-5, just as it seemed that Taffy 3 must be completely overwhelmed, Admiral Kurita made a decision that stunned both sides. He ordered his fleet to break off the attack and withdraw. The escort carriers, their ammunition exhausted and their escort sunk or damaged, had achieved the impossible. They had turned back the most powerful Japanese surface force of the war. Through sheer courage and determination, the battle off Samar was over, but its heroes would be remembered forever as the sailors who saved Leyte Gulf. Through their willing sacrifice and extraordinary valor, as Admiral Kurita's battered center force limped away from Samar Island. On the afternoon of October 25, 1944, Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet was completing the destruction of Vice Admiral Ozawa's northern force. 400 miles to the north, the Japanese carriers, their sacrificial mission accomplished, died one by one under the overwhelming assault of American dive bombers and torpedo planes. The fleet carrier Zuikaku, last survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack force, fought her final battle with the dignity befitting her illustrious history. Veteran of Coral Sea, Midway, and the Philippine Sea, she had been the backbone of Japanese carrier aviation for 3 years. Now, overwhelmed by repeated airstrikes from Task Force 38, she rolled over and sank at 2:14 in the afternoon, taking Admiral Ozawa and 700 sailors with her. The light carriers Weiho, Chitos, and Chiyoda followed their flagship to the bottom, victims of the massive American air armada that Halsey had unleashed against them. By evening, Japanese carrier aviation had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The Northern Force's mission was complete. They had successfully lured Halsey away from Leyte Gulf, but at the cost of the Imperial Navy's last operational aircraft carriers. Meanwhile, the aftermath of the morning's battle off Samar revealed the true cost of heroism. The escort carrier Gambier Bay lay on the ocean floor, the only American aircraft carrier sunk by enemy surface gunfire during the entire war. The destroyers Johnston, Hull, and Samuel B. Roberts had fought their last battle, their crews scattered across the shark-infested waters of the Philippine Sea. Over 1,000 American sailors had paid the ultimate price for their defiance of impossible odds. But their sacrifice had not been in vain. Admiral Sprague's surviving carriers St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitkin Bay, and Fanshawe Bay had successfully protected MacArthur's landing force from destruction. The transports and supply ships clustered in Leyte Gulf remained intact, ensuring that the American foothold in the Philippines would survive and strengthen. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison concluded in his comprehensive analysis that the Battle of Leyte Gulf represented the decisive victory that effectively ended Japanese naval power in the Pacific, with losses that could never be replaced. The final act of the Great Battle came at 10:51 that morning when a lone Japanese aircraft, part of the first organized kamikaze attack of the war, crashed into the escort carrier St. Lo. The suicide pilot's bomb detonated the ship's torpedo magazine, causing a massive explosion that tore the carrier apart. She sank within minutes, a grim preview of the desperate tactics Japan would employ in the war's final months. As the sun set on October 25th, the statistics of the Battle of Leyte Gulf told the story of Japan's naval defeat. The Imperial Navy had lost for aircraft carriers 3 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 12 destroyers, over half their remaining combat strength. More than 10,000 Japanese sailors had perished, including many of their most experienced officers and crew. American losses, while significant, were far less severe. 1 light carrier to escort carriers to destroyers, 1 destroyer escort, and approximately 3,000 casualties. The industrial might of the United States could replace these losses within months. Japan's shattered fleet could never be rebuilt. Admiral Kurita's decision to withdraw from Samar had saved his remaining ships, but doomed Japan's last hope for naval victory. Emperor Hirohito's admirals had gambled everything on Operation Shogo 1 and lost. The sea lanes to the Dutch East Indies were now permanently severed, cutting off Japan's access to the oil resources essential for continuing the war. General MacArthur's forces, secure behind their naval shield, continued pouring ashore on Leyte. The liberation of the Philippines could proceed without interference from the Imperial Navy, which had effectively ceased to exist as a strategic force. The road to Tokyo lay open, guarded by the most powerful fleet in human history. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had decided the fate of the Pacific War. In 4 days of unprecedented naval combat, American sea power had achieved complete victory over its last serious challenger. The age of American naval dominance had begun, built on the sacrifice of heroes like Ernest Evans and his crew, who had shown that courage could triumph even against impossible odds. The greatest naval battle in history was over. The United States Navy had crushed the Imperial Japanese fleet in the largest clash of warships ever fought, securing American victory in the Pacific and changing the course of world history forever.